motion and in flux. But there is something which is also preserved, which is in a sense transcendent. And it's a reflection of God's names, the one who persists, the one who endures. So that is preserved in the human soul, from your seeing. So he doesn't see that it's a problem.
I think here maybe Ibn Arabi might be a useful figure here. He talks about the archetypes of everything, the main, how to say, programs or main.
By that he means God's knowledge of things.
Yeah, they are in the knowledge, the models according to which everything is created, and there is a a kind of fixity.
Yeah.
If you look, if
You
you
can-
wish, in that field.
I think you can resemble that idea to the idea of Plato's ideas. Plato's ideas was exactly positive. I mean, this is my reading of Plato, to answer that challenge. Okay, there's change. How can we know things? There has to be something beyond, right? Ideas, fixed ideas, and that fixity was provided to you by Ibn Arabi. But before him, actually, there are others who are saying similar things. It's not peculiar to Ibn Arabi. And it was then used a lot of times, like this idea of fixed entities, which are in the knowledge of God. Or I was referring to, there's an infinite possibilities, right? These possibilities can be seen as fixed entities. God knows them. Nothing can escape God's knowledge. That is fixed. Only that is fixed. And then God effuses its being to that possibilities and creates them, starts to create them. And God is infinite, right? And there shouldn't be that repetition of tajalli. La tekrar fit tajalli, he says. There shouldn't be a repetition of tajalli because of divine vastness, divine infinity. God creates anew at each moment, but a different form. That's why we see change. This is how he explains things. But this is a theosophical explanation, as you can see, right? This is a purely theosophical explanation. It doesn't explain it in physical terms, but it gives you a metaphysical sources of, right, change. There's fixed. God's knowledge is fixed. That cannot change. But the world constantly changing because God is infinite, basically. Yes?
Sorry, I have a problem with the notion of God being infinite, because infinite is a mathematical term.
Mm-hmm.
And you either have potential infinites or actual infinites, so which one would God be?
Absolute might be a better term.
I think absolute personally, I think is a better word to describe God, because then you get into the issue of, is God potentially infinite? If that's the case, he can never actually self-express or self-disclose because he's only potentially infinite. And if he's actually infinite, then
Yeah.
I mean, it may be nitpicking linguistically, but
Sure. That's a discussion as well. We can talk about that all day, but I don't think we have time for it. But that, I think Ibn Arabi has his own answers for that challenge.
Could I just say something? I'm not sure whether I misunderstood your question. I think the Ash'aris don't deny numerical identity across time. And I think that's closely related to the fact that they accept the distinction between substance and accident. So substances are numerically identical. Zayd, the person, is the same across instants. But it's the accidents that have to be perpetually recreated and are not numerically identical. And even that assumption, later Ash'aris, once the influence of philosophy starts to become profound, so with Ghazali and onwards, even that doctrine is abandoned by the Ash'aris. And they come to see that our earlier arguments for accidents having to be constantly recreated are not compelling. So I just wanted to insert that little footnote.
So, just on this very point, actually, I just wanted to make this suggestion that, in fact, it's a very old philosophical problem. Whenever we try to explain change as a succession of static moments, we run into exactly the same kind of problems. It's actually known as the Zenonic problem, and it manifests itself in the example that this whether creation is whether there's identity with change and things like that, but also in all sorts of other problems. Whenever we try to explain something that is evidently changing, while at the same time keeping a certain identity in it. And so it's a very recurring problem in the very, whenever we try to sort of explain or describe, change as a succession of static moments. So that was my first comment. Can I make a second one? Okay. The second one is actually with about, and thank you very much because you've given us so much to think about. But I wanted to make a comment about Caitlin's presentation. This is just a comment on Ibn Haman. What's interesting is if one looks at Nicomachean ethics, the term that Aristotle uses, a term that Aristotle uses, which is proairesis, which is in the Arabic translation of Nicomachean ethics, is translated as ikhtiyar, is actually in Aristotle actually has three dimensions. It means at the same time choice. It means decision arrived at through deliberation, but it means actually also something that we might translate as resolve. And what I find interesting in, just gave me this idea when I was listening to you, is that even though the philosophers, when they comment, the Arabic philosophers, when they comment on Aristotle, are very aware of these three dimensions in Aristotle, of course, in the commentaries of the commentaries, this three dimension to ikhtiyar is lost, and it's reduced to simply choice. And what's interesting, I find, is Ibn Haman introduces this dimension of azm, which I would translate as resolve. And in a sense, we might actually want to see him, if we compare that to the occurrences of proairesis in Nicomachean ethics, as possibly actually, in fact, with this introduction of azm, as going back to Aristotle and being actually closer to this third dimension of proairesis than Aristotle. So within the discussions, yes, he's trying to sort of oppose what's going on in this discussion. But it's interesting that if we look at him in connection with, in direct connection with Aristotle, he's actually introducing a dimension that is already in Aristotle. So.
I just want to go back to the question, the very first question about escaping pantheism. I think one of the problems that in the current Islamic Muslim discourses, or maybe in the Western discourses, when approaching the Islamic writings, is that, according to Nursi, in one of his earlier writings, he said that, as I think Özgür was doing, that we should have set up some premises or some preconditions while considering causality, and one of which it would have been talking about the different realms existing in Islamic world. We've already talked about it, that Özgür and Colin addressed the so-called ibda and insha, the vertical and horizontal realms existing, and maybe, as Özgür also, according to Ibn Arabi, talked about that they are intertwined. Nursi, going back to what I was trying to say, in one of his earlier writings he said that in the last several centuries the Muslim scholars made the very basic mistake when talking about different realms with different terminologies. We know that this world, according to the Muslim scholars, we call it Darul Hikmah, the realm of causes, where the cause and effect take place, so-called the cause and effect. But we also call and accept in Islam that there are different realms, like Darul Qudra, a world of power, where the causes are less, like in the hereafter we'll witness to that day. But also, like we human beings are so fixated that the realms are either on top of each other or following each other. But I believe they are intertwined. They exist at the same time. As Ibda and Isha take place at the same time, but because of our incapability, or we are limited, we cannot comprehend or see that the two creation taking at the same time, the Ibda and Isha, the ex nihilo creation and creation by change. And Nursi made the point that we make the mistake while talking about the Darul Hikmah, we use the terminology of Darul Qudra, or the terminology of the world of power. And therefore we mix the things up. So while considering Ibn Arabi, that the Muslim scholars also talk about the different layers of knowledge, ilm, or acquiring or reaching the ilm. And like Nursi talks about seven different layers of ilm. And there is one layer, it is called Zevk Ruhani, where you... Zevk Ruhani, how can you translate it?
Spiritual pleasure.
Spiritual pleasure, where you enjoy the knowledge. And what some of Arabi's writings, according to Nursi, reflect that level. And if somebody is not in that level, he says, he or she shouldn't interpret or apply that knowledge or digest that knowledge. It's something unique to that person, that he is in a different layer. But in the last several centuries, he says that because of this so-called confusion of not applying the different terminologies into different realms, made a mess, he said. That's one of the, I think that Chitik of, according to Özgür, stated that Ibn Arabi never used the term Wahdat al-Wujud. It is applied to his discourse later in time.
By Ibn Taymiyyah.
Yeah. So that's something that I wanted to clarify there.
Chrissy, you talked about the same thing.
Yeah.
How do you assume it?
I mean, do you mean generally or in Al-Ghazali, the pantheist issue? I mean, it seems to me in Al-Ghazali the perspective of real existence as opposed to, necessitarian view of divine agency is very obvious, and it's very obvious, let's say, even in the Mishkat, because the more advanced people have a very great understanding that we're not talking about initiating emotion, but we are talking about existence that a absolutely omnipotent and transcendent God bestows on creatures. So it seems to me within the occasionalist framework, God relates to action in a very different way than the creatures do. So God really creates brings together the occasions and creates an action, but the creatures just acquire that. There is acquisition. And I think when we come to the acquisition, that's very humanly difficult to understand what exactly it is, because I guess still, I talk about myself, I'm very uninitiated. I am in the realm of multiplicity, so I haven't, me and others, I haven't joined the realm of the attainers. So if we join the group of the attainers and we come so close to the source of causation, we may see how all things are so inextricably connected. But I guess in order to understand Ghazali's occasionalism and why it is not a pantheism, one should never lose sight of this idea that God is an absolute creator. And I think he is very emphatic about it, even when he comes to the fourth group, the attainers. That is, even when we are in the most mystical level, he makes sure we remember that this is not simply alpha now, but in unity with God. Moreover, who has been described as something much more than the Aristotelian or the falsafa God. So I think that's the step preceding the notion of unity of everything. So yeah, I think that is very, very important. Moreover, I would think that when we talk about occasionalism, at least in the Ghazalian way, we are still talking about a world in which we don't have a chaotic kind of existence. I mean, Ghazali says, well, we shouldn't be worried. We don't have to listen to the worries of the falsafa people that, you know, because God is omnipotent, the moment I turn my back, my books turn into a beast, sort of thing. So I guess the source of this regularity, however we may interpret the regularity, has to be a transcendent God, not a God who is identical with the world. So I guess that's my way to escape it. But to say that I'm very successful, no. I mean, I don't think in this world we can be very successful.
Do you have a question?
I noticed a really interesting thread between the al-Maturidi view of God's acting in creation and also the Imarabi view. So I think if I heard this correctly, al-Maturidi's view was the sort of concept of adat Allah, God's constant way of acting in the creation. And then we had Imarabi's view of the infinite must create. We have the breath of God, which is the manifestation of the creation. And I guess what I'm interested in is if you think about modern cosmology in chaos theory and physics, there's this tendency now where many contemporary theologians are looking for a place in the creation to fit God's action in. So if we go down to the quantum level, well, maybe there's a place God can sneak in and do some creative action, and that's troubling for me. I think I align more to the concept of God's breath as, the manifestation of something in creation. So I guess what I want to just throw out to anyone is to just speak to a deterministic versus an indeterministic view of an account of God's acting from the Islamic perspective, and maybe what some contemporary Islamic theologians, how are they viewing God's action in the world?
I can have a few words on that, but I spoke too much. Maybe. If you don't want to. Okay. I agree. I think all of those things may fall into, at the end of the day, given the God of the gaps, in chaos. By the way, on the John Polkinghorne, Nancy Murphy, Russell, Clayton, they're careful about not falling into that trap. God of the gaps. They're very careful. They don't want to deal with the causal nexus of the world. The world should still be explainable in terms of causal connections, but at the end of the day, you also want to have causal intervention by God in places which escapes science look, right? We'll see how it's gonna. It's still a discussion among in that field, in the field of religion and science. But I think occasionalism in particular, Ibn Arabi's maybe metaphysical framework in general may be helpful here, because occasionalism tells you that, look, we don't have to create gaps in the causal nexus to see God. God is in what is explainable, because God is creating both cause and effect and attaching them to each other on a self-imposed habitual pattern. That's why we have laws. And in this case, both cause and effect is being created by God. And you don't need gaps to fill it with God, because everything is being created. And the occasionalist universe, that's why, is indistinguishable from a universe which is governed by secondary causality. And I see this as an advantage in terms of using occasionalist theory for Muslims to deal with the problem of science. I think the discussion between religion and science at the end of the day is boiling down to the question of causality. Now we have a causal theory here, occasionalism, which seems to deal with it in a quite successful way. But there are problems with occasionalism, theological problems, not ontological, theological. Then what are you going to do with the question of free will? Because occasionalism seems to end in determinism. How are we going to escape that? You know, Ibn Humam is dealing with that question. You know, Kasb, Ash'ari says Kasb, but at the end of the day, they all seem to fail to explain this difficulty. Okay, as Nazif accepts in his dissertation as well. Now, the theory of Kasb is the theory of Kasb. You know, you say
any account about to explain free will is not.
Another problem. Free will and the theory of evil. I mean, the question of evil. The question of how are you going to explain the evil? Is God creating evil as well? Now, these are big questions in front of occasionalism. Occasionalism have very distinct advantages in terms of religion and science discussion, but theological problem. What are you going to do with that? And here I believe personally, but I have to mature these thoughts. I'm just talking off the top of my head right now. Ibn Arabi can help to occasionalists. Ibn Arabi can help, but at the expense of what? At the expense of leading you to a kind of ambiguity, right? Neither nor, either or, right? How? Let's say free will, right? Free will. Now, in Ibn Arabi, the separation is not real; it's perspectival. There, we will with the will of God. Now, if we say I will, I'm right. If I say the God's will, that's right too for him. This is a perspectival logic. It will take you to this perspective. There God wills, and here I will. They can be reconciled, he says. Now, to deal with these problems, occasionalism might need help. Okay, although it's distinct advantages, occasionalism I see is a promising causal theory because there are no gaps at least, right? But yeah, there are problems still.
I just want to emphasize that since we are engaged in talking about the problem of free will, it is not a problem within the Islamic theology, philosophy, or how to say, intellectual tradition. It's one of the most intractable problems of philosophy. Okay, so not just occasionalists, but everybody are invited to contribute to this.
Yeah, true. Actually, you can see philosophy as something.
Well, I'd like to have basically following up on this discussion by bringing a modern day analogy. If we're thinking, for example, of video games, a programmer programs the program, the video game, and of course the players, they decide what to do. They are not creating the actions within the video game, but they are taking the decisions of how the agent inside this video game is going to do, but they're not creating the actual actions within that video game. Now, saying that, however, if we consider that the program is now the one that's creating the actions, and if God created this program in which this program is creating those actions, then perhaps it is not directly God that is dealing with or creating the actions that people make or decide. Otherwise, if we do consider that it is God directly still creating those actions, then we are coming up again with the issue of pantheism and panentheism by assuming that the program itself is God. So, what is your take on that?
Morsi has a very interesting idea. I think it comes from Martin Luther. He says that human beings have something called ma'alan, which is an inclination, which is not caused by anything, and it's not governed by any outside factor, any external factor. And he doesn't actually give the example, but I think in Western philosophy there is the problem of Buridan's ass, who's choosing between two equal bales of hay. And Ghazali also has his idea that if you're choosing between two equal piles of dates, there is no external factor which is going to preponderate to make you take this one rather than that one. And that shows that human beings have absolute free choice. Human beings can choose either this pile of dates, which is identical to that one, without any external factors actually preponderating. And he uses that as an example to say that human beings have free choice to want something, to incline towards something. But whether that actually materializes in the form of an action which is consistent with that desire, as in many times we desire to do something, it doesn't actually happen because something obstructs us or impedes us, or I stand up to walk across the room to make a cup of tea, and I, God forbid, have a stroke, which was not my intention. my choice is different from the action which follows on after that choice. And while we see usually that, sunnat or God's, in a sense, way of creating or habit is usually consistent with our desires or our sort of mayalan or inclining, it doesn't always work. So what is absolutely free for Nursi, and which actually gives us the taklif or responsibility, is that absolute, unimpeded, unhindered ability to choose between two things. Now, in lots of circumstances in life, of course, our choices are actually, in a sense, pre-programmed. For example, if I see tea and coffee here, I'm going to have tea because I'm from England. And I always drink tea rather than coffee. So that is not really important for Nursi. I think what he's saying is there is something in human beings which is not caused by anything and which God does not create.
Yeah.
There's something which inheres in human beings which makes human beings absolutely responsible for their own actions, and that is this ability to incline towards this or to incline towards that freely.
Yes.
It's not always free, as I said, because sometimes it's coloured by the way we're brought up or where we're born, where we come from. But there are situations in which human beings are absolutely free to choose this way or that way, and that's what makes us responsible.
Yeah. For a follow-up, I might just add, I point out two problems, right? Evil and the free will, right? And I think Nursi has a lot to say about this issue. He can be seen as an occasionalist, but in a different way. He's making use of Ibn Arabi and Ghazali's syncretism, right? He's making use of these things to overcome these problems. And in that regard, I think Nursi can make a lot of contributions to save vocation from these pitfalls. By the way, which I am investigating in my forthcoming book. Wait for that. Instead ads in my dissertation. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so if you're an occasionalist, you hold that every created thing in every aspect is ontologically dependent on God at every moment. If you're an occasionalist by definition. So the problem then would be explain how a created thing could ever be functionally independent when it's so thoroughgoingly ontologically dependent.
Yeah.
And it seemed like it's one thing to say they're just say they're functionally independent, but occasionalism ties you to thoroughgoing ontological dependence.
Yeah, yes. That's why Nursi is positing something uncreated. That's. But I'm going to stop my talk.
Right, and I feel like that's kind of like at the heart of what I was trying to talk about, kind of this, and it's interesting that you brought up the inclination, because in Ibn Humam's thought, inclinations are something that's created by God, and then he locates that kind of, the thing that man brings forth elsewhere is that determination, that as a Muslim. So it's kind of interesting that different thinkers are kind of, I feel like, looking for the same thing, but end up locating it.
I think they also take steps back, because when they find something like inclination, which is created by God, okay, we need to find something which isn't created by God. So Nursi, for example, will say that, according to Maturidi, it's not the inclination, because inclination is created by God, it's the ability to use tasarruf, the inclination. So there's always this stepping back to find something which is absolutely independent but not created.
Right, and I feel like then that's where like the second thinker, right, El Sanusi comes in, and he's like, guys, like you're not succeeding at this. If we step back and think about this rationally, like ultimately God has delegated this. We don't, it's too, the stakes are too high to say that this is something that's totally belongs to humans. And so that, I think that's where El Sanusi comes in and is like, there's not. Like, this is an utterly occasionalist system, but I'm kind of coming to grips with it because I have this divine command ethics where God's justice is just beyond what I can comprehend.
Yeah.
But going back to the idea of absolute freedom of human beings to make this choice or to have this inclination or to use this inclination, Nursi would say that because human beings are manifestations of God and all of his names, one of God's names is the absolutely free one. And that has to have some kind of instantiation or some kind of reflection in the human being.
So,
I know it still doesn't.
we still have two more questions and we've run out of time. So I will use my privilege to have the last few questions, and then we maybe have a summary.
Use your
Please.
free will to
Yes.
interview.
Isn't bringing forth variations from non-existence to existence require an intermediate stage in between where the rule of manifestation or tajaliyat that is taking place in it and the continuous guidance of the laws will give a chance to that creature that came from the nothingness of the non-existence to show the will or the azm to acquire or kasab in order to develop toward that ultimate goal of eternal existence. I don't know if it's a question or just, my feeling after.
I just want to add a comment to what Colin said. We know from Prophet Muhammad's hadith that actually for example, if we intend to do something, for example, I want to give charity and I really decided to do that, but something happened, I couldn't do that, I will still be rewarded. But if I want to do something bad, but I couldn't do it, I'm not going to be punished. But if I am able to do it, I'm going to be punished. And it's like if you really intend to, it's really intention. Like functionally, we are not independent. Actions are created by God, but we have this free will. I don't know, it's maybe coming from God's breed. I don't know how to explain that. But if it's right, like if it's very dense, like at some point God decides either to do it or like either create that action or not. But we are actually responsible from our intentions, not from the actions.
Yeah. Intentions precede actions.
Such inclination or preference between and equality through creation.
So could you repeat that, please?
I just can't understand how to deal with the contradiction between the inclination or free will and the equality during the creation.
Equality during
The creation.
Recreation.
Did you also?
Oh, well, do I have time?
I thought we should have all of the questions and then maybe have
We can talk at lunch about the question.
Maybe this is a comment, but so I'm interested in this problem of reconciling occasionalism and free will because you get it in Malebranche, because he wants to say we have control over our consent. So I'll just mention his solution and see whether it's related to other solutions. So his view is essentially consent is doing nothing. So in consenting, we're not creating anything. So there's no tension with occasionalism. I'm wondering whether there's a similar sort of response open to Islamic thinkers on that issue.
we've run out of time, but if we want to go out of time, we can.
Just one thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Actually, Malebranche's account is very close to Sayyid Mursi, which in the tradition goes back to Sadr Sharia. Because according to that framework, power does not apply to a certain ontological realm, which is not an object of creation or under causal power. So physical objects have some kind of existence which needs to be created, but relations between physical objects, like this is on the right of this and this is on the left of this. These relations are not some objects that needs to be caused or created. In that sense, it's close to Malebranche. And that ontological sphere is not open to causal interaction and anything else. And free will is explained to that ontological
But just that doesn't solve the problem. I can talk about it.
And on that note,
In 1,000 years we've been talking about this issue. We cannot solve it.
so I think we have a lunch break now, and we'll commence again at.
So we will eat the lunch in the next room across the corridor, the brown room. Around 1:20 we will be here.